So once again, very warm welcome to this panel session 2.2 on harnessing climate SDG synergies and co-benefits while closing the ambition gap. And for those of you who may be joining late, once again, apologies for the session itself starting late, as they say in the airline industry. The incoming flight was late, so it's not my fault that we're starting late. We have a pretty busy panel, very good panel, excellent panel, but we do have at least one dropout for reasons of illness. Mr. Bill Hare, co-founder and CEO of Climate Analytics, will not be able to join us as he's feeling a little unwell. And I think we have most of our other speakers here. Everybody apart from me is participating in a virtual mode. Speaks to the climate sensitivity, I guess, that's coming in all of us. So that's really great. We will start with a couple of keynote statements. I will be doubling up both as a moderator and somebody who will be providing a keynote statement, sort of, to be followed by Mr. Sergey Kononov, Manager Programs Coordination, UNFCCC. And then we have a set of panelists who I will introduce as we go along in the session. The keynote speakers have been asked to make a statement on net zero or not zero, ensuring effectiveness and credibility of climate action. With the permission of Mr. Kononov, my co-keynote speaker, I will start with a few comments. And while the presentation is coming up, let me say that in my own interpretation of what we will be speaking about, the question is not so much net zero as it is of when can or should net zero be achieved by different countries, nuanced, of course, by achievement of the SDG goals, so that globally we achieve net zero by 2050, or if possible, earlier, given what we are experiencing in terms of climatic changes or extreme events across the globe already. The reason why, of course, we are very concerned is these very risks that we are facing, and risks, as we know, are a combination of three components: hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. We have to find a balance between everything that we are doing, whether we talk about climate change or SDGs or the various components that we are speaking about. And to me, the higher the underachievement of climate goals, the higher is the scale of hazards and therefore the risks for the underdeveloped. On the other hand, the higher the underachievement of SDG goals, the higher would be both exposure and vulnerability, the other two parts of the risk triangle. But what we are seeing today is the underachievement of both climate and SDG goals, and therefore I think we are seeing an exacerbation of all three elements of risk: hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And that's the key concern that we all are facing. So therefore, the real question is, are we seeking to minimize globally average risks, treating all three pillars of sustainable development in a balanced manner and treating all geographies equally? Or is this where international cooperation draws its boundaries? Every country has vulnerabilities to a smaller or larger extent. The question again is, does economics win or do societal considerations really win? The questions that I have been raising thus far translate into questions of values, ethics, and equity. Before I come to the slide that you see on the screen, unfortunately, as we know, the world is off track on both climate change and SDGs, and therefore the risks are high on all accounts. But I think one of the things that really has caught us by surprise, or at least you hear a lot of people talking about it, is the fact that we are getting sidetracked also by the various disruptions that we are seeing across the world. I do not think that when these agreements were made in 2015 on climate change and SDGs, we expected the world to remain in the status quo situation. Disruptions have been and will be part of developments as we go along. The question is, how well prepared are we for these disruptions, and are we able to exploit the opportunities, therefore, that are created as a result of these disruptions, be they negative or positive. But what it also points to us is that while we are, as per the theme of this conference, focused on the synergies, we equally need to be able to focus on trade-offs that, again, do exist. We do know for a fact that the ambition gap that we are witnessing across the world is driven by a perception of trade-offs, which is possibly stronger than the recognition of synergies that exist, not just between climate change goals and SDG goals, but within the SDG goals themselves, as the figure that is in front of you is highlighting. The purpose of sharing this particular slide with you, and for those of you who are online and who cannot see the room, we do have a large number of students with us as well in the room, and I'm really happy to see the fact that we have so many young people in the room with us. So the purpose of showing this particular slide is to bring out the complexity of the subject that we are dealing with. We have not just synergies and trade-offs by themselves, but we have both synergies and trade-offs between any two pairs of SDG goals that we might take a look at, or even beyond. So looking at synergies, evaluating them, assessing them is a very complex task that we are dealing with over here. Since we are focused on climate and SDG synergies and taking climate therefore as an entry point, we do have to recognize that we have no real silver bullets on the climate goals. It's not something that I'm saying. This is really speaking from a paper that has been published in Environmental Research Letters in 2021, where it has been recognized that all the 1.5 scenarios that have been assessed in the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees basically build around 5 key levers that we have available for reaching the net zero commitments that we are aiming for, which is to look at decarbonization in the energy transport industry and building sectors, to look at a massive scaling up of technologies to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the transformation of global agricultural and land use practices, major changes in global consumer behavior, and reduction of non-CO2 greenhouse gases and other short-lived climate forces. So the different scenarios that have been evaluated look at these 5 levers that are available to societies across the world, governments across the world, to see how we can reach net zero. But each of these 5 levers that we are talking about, if you were to look at a reasonable or a moderately ambitious achievement of or pursuit of these levers, we are not going to be able to meet the 1.5 degree scenarios. What we need is actually transformations in all of these 5 levers. So much more ambitious scale at which these levers are going to be able to be achieved. This is not easy to do unless there are significant commitments that are made by all stakeholders in economies. And very often when we do not assume that we can make these transformative changes in these 5 levers that I was talking about, then it becomes even more essential for us to really look at carbon dioxide removal technologies. I do believe that while we have to possibly use and resort to the use of these CDR technologies, the carbon dioxide removal technologies, we still are a fairly long way from having these to be commercially proven and to be able to say with a high degree of confidence that we may not see any side effects from these technologies. So therefore, I think it is essential for us to look at all these other levers, 4 of the other levers that we are talking about, so that we minimize for the time being the use of carbon dioxide or the reliance on carbon dioxide removal technologies, so that we are able to remain at this 1.5 degree level that we are talking about. Very often for those scenarios that do not take into account the CDR technologies, the authors of this particular paper that we are talking about, Lila Warzowski and others, say that the other scenarios make very optimistic assumptions on population growth, dietary changes, and demand side changes in the energy system. These are also unlikely to be achieved unless there is a high degree of commitment, especially from governments, on putting in place the right policy and regulatory levers to be able to exploit the potential of these changes in bringing about a reduction in emissions. But rapid innovation of lifestyles, social systems, and patterns of global cooperation, in addition to technical innovation, are going to be critically important for keeping the 1.5 degree Celsius target within reach. Unfortunately, there is not enough analysis of these aspects of bringing about a reduction. Next slide, please. On the next 2 or 3 slides, I will just quickly speak about the same CDR technologies and the importance of timing. In a conventional 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, the majority of the scenarios that we speak about, we basically assume that there is a little bit of an inertia in the policy, social, and technology changes that we are able to effect, and therefore there is a delay in the peak emissions that we might have, and as a result of which we would overshoot the goals that we have, at least at some time during the time frame of now and 2050, as a result of which we will need to deploy the carbon dioxide removal technologies. In this case, we would have to look at some negative emissions from BECCS and other opportunities that we have. But on the right-hand side of the figure, next slide, yes, thank you. We see illustration where if we are able to bring about a much more rapid transformation, which is also driven by end-use changes, a much higher degree of innovation, and behavior and lifestyle changes that we were talking about, then we would definitely be able to accelerate the reductions in emissions and keep within the 1.5 degrees Celsius guardrail that we have, without necessarily having to rely on carbon dioxide removal technologies in the timeframes that we are addressing ourselves to. The problem with the scenario that is presented, illustrated on the right, is of course the costs that are associated with it. If we invest now, can you just make a couple of other clicks? Thank you. So if we invest now in bringing about emissions reductions in a much more rapid manner, a few more please, then you would have to see a much higher level of investments taking place early, but it would keep us within the 1.5 degrees Celsius range. And oh, sorry, can you go back? Yeah, there's something wrong with the slides, it seems. However, let's not worry about it. What we would see is higher upfront costs of rapid transformations towards these net zero emissions. No? Okay. Maybe you can take it off the display, the presentation mode, and see. Now this seems to be, unless you can fix this.
Here. Oh.
Okay. So there is a trade-off between high upfront cost of rapid transformations towards net zero emissions and a lower GDP as a result of that. Or you could basically delay the transformations that are taking place, look at an overshoot and reduce the upfront costs, but there would be a lower level of recovery of GDP as we go forward. No, it's not the right slide. No. Sorry. So I'm sorry about that. That's got a little messed up. So the trade-offs that we have is high levels of investment today, but higher GDP tomorrow, or lower levels of investment today, but higher levels of GDP tomorrow. But it would help us to avoid carbon dioxide removal technologies that we're talking about. But if we do that, I think we would be a little more certain about the emissions reductions. The next slide that we have that we are seeing on the screen right now is about, again, illustratively showing these emission pathways. And what this is really showing is the different sectors and how these will move over time depending on the zero emission pathways that we follow. And essentially what this is showing is that there are certain sectors in which we can accelerate the emissions reductions and actually move to a zero emissions or a negative emissions, as in the case of the agriculture, forestry and land use sector, the green strip that you see at the bottom over here. Whereas other sectors of the economy would probably need and deserve more time to be able to move to net zero emissions themselves. So there is this time trade-off that we have between sectors of the economy. And in a similar fashion, actually, there is another slide which I do not have over here, which also shows in a similar fashion that for countries, you can have differently defined pathways with a few countries that are lower in the development curve having opportunity to be able to delay their emissions of emission reduction goals to beyond 2050, whereas other countries can possibly accelerate their emission reduction goals to before 2050, so that we, on an average at a global level, remain at net zero by 2050, which is one of the targets that we have. So I think the scenarios that have been presented in various literatures show us these opportunities of trade-offs and a much more equitable way of dealing with emissions reductions. The final slide that I'll just share with you very quickly is also to be able to illustrate the fact that it is much more difficult for us to be able to achieve and put in place the institutional changes that are required to support these zero emission pathways. The technical changes, the economic changes, and some of the socio-cultural changes are actually much more feasible and likely today than the institutional changes, and that is what this graph is showing. Institutional governance challenges dominate over technology and economic concerns, but are more difficult to be able to put in place. And today, I think we need to recognize that it is these institutional changes that are possibly a little bit more of a barrier to arriving at net zero emissions in an accelerated manner than the technologies themselves that are available to us. So in a sense, the sum and substance of the message that I was trying to give you, despite the challenges with slides, is the fact that the zero emissions pathways by 2050 are possible. We are likely to move at very different pace in different sectors of the economy and different countries of the world. But that is fine, and it remains in line with the differentiated responsibilities that we keep speaking about across these sectors and economies. Yeah, it's possible to be able to do that. So thank you very much. With those introductory remarks, I would like to give the floor to the next keynote speaker, Mr. Sergey Kononov, who's Manager Programs Coordination at the UNFCCC. Mr. Kononov, may I please ask you to take the floor? Thank you. Mr. Kononov, are you online?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Yeah. So I try to display one slide. I don't know whether you see it, but anyway.
Yes.
Okay, I will not be actually going through the slide, but I would like to have it visible while I am speaking. Our UNFCCC Secretariat is happy to contribute to this important meeting. And as many of you may know, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, entered into force in the early 1990s. Already at that time, the convention recognized that action on climate change is inseparable from a broader context of sustainable development. More recently, in 2015, the Paris Agreement explicitly emphasized the intrinsic relationship that climate change actions, responses, and impacts have with equitable access to sustainable development and the eradication of poverty. Consequently, linkages between climate action and sustainable development, including sustainable development goals, have been well recognized at both international and national levels. At the international level, the most recent climate change conference in Glasgow adopted the so-called Glasgow Climate Pact and many other decisions, aiming to limit the rising global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This strengthened action on climate change consistent with SDG 13. At the same time, it also helped in the implementation of a number of other SDGs closely linked to climate action, in particular on gender equality, on affordable and clean energy, on decent work and economic growth, on sustainable cities and communities, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and last but definitely not least, SDG 17, which is partnerships for other goals. Importantly, the Glasgow Climate Pact recognized that global crises of climate change and biodiversity loss are interlinked and noted the critical role of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystem in delivering benefits for climate adaptation and mitigation. At the national level, the nationally determined contributions submitted by parties under the Paris Agreement have started providing valuable information on how climate action in both adaptation and mitigation relates to sustainable development. And this is actually illustrated in the graphs you see on the slide. In accordance with these assessments, action on adaptation to climate change is most frequently linked to food production and nutrition security, freshwater resources, terrestrial and wetland ecosystems, and health, which are, as we know, addressed under relevant SDGs. The regional and local context is known to be highly important for identifying and using such synergies. Similarly, measures to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions are often linked with other measures in energy supply, contributing to achieving SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy, and measures in land use change and forestry, contributing to achieving SDG 15, life on land. To be a bit more specific, let me give one example. Namely, actions to address land degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change are well known to play complementary reinforcing roles. If done right, with proper consideration of relevant regional and local factors, the systems set up to address either of these issues will eventually benefit the others. This means at national, regional, and local levels, we need strong interaction and coordination in addressing the goals and targets on land degradation, biodiversity, and climate change, ultimately in line also with the Sustainable Development Goals. These are good examples, but one should still not lose sight of the remaining challenges, which are still significant. At the national level, coordination and cooperation of relevant institutions is key for planning and implementation of climate change policies and actions. And this is also key for making climate action fully integrated in the relevant economic and social policies consistent with sustainable development. This includes also the receipt and use of international support where it is relevant. Also there, coordination and cooperation are key to ensure that those resources are used in a manner that fits best the priorities of sustainable development. Such coordination already happens through a variety of arrangements, as we can see in the latest NDCs submitted by parties under the Paris Agreement. Still, coordinated, coherent and efficient implementation of all sustainability dimensions at national, regional and local levels remains a challenge requiring close attention by governments and non-governmental stakeholders. At the international level, cooperation among international organizations within the United Nations system in particular is needed to address these linkages effectively and efficiently. Our Secretariat is strongly engaged in such cooperation, also through the joint liaison group of the 3 Rio Conventions. This group aims to promote implementation of transformative projects that integrate action on land degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change. There are also other mechanisms in place to identify and utilize synergies, and we also know that what we do is still not enough. In short, we have recognized and already started addressing linkages between climate action and sustainable development, but it is only a beginning and more needs to be done. What we need are strong, collaborating institutions at all levels with the ability to understand, advise, and ultimately act on aligning national development priorities with specific actions on climate change and other sustainability dimensions. This is not easy to achieve, but this is the only way to move forward towards genuine sustainable development effectively and coherently. All guiding questions for this session, which you have, are highly relevant in that regard, and I'm sure that the panel discussion will contribute to us finding at least some answers to those questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sergei Kononov, and thank you also for stressing once again the importance of coordinated and cooperative action, which I think is, of course, critically important, and of course the challenges of being able to do this both at a global as well as at a national level. We can now move possibly to the discussion with the invited speakers that we have on this particular session. We will start with the video message that we have from Mr. Alexander Dukarev, Head of the Division of Department of the Ministry of Economic Development from the Russian Foundation, followed by the speakers that we have present online with us today. So can we start the video message, please?
I'm glad to take part in this parallel session and share Russia's perspective on the topic under discussion. In the last few years, Russia has moved forward in terms of both SDGs implementation and climate action. In 2020, we have presented our first voluntary national review and nationally determined contribution, showing our progress and communicating our ambitions to the international community. Since then, we managed to design outstanding SDG monitoring framework and better integrate SDGs into our strategic planning, as well as lay the ground for national climate regulation framework, including but not limited to long-term low emissions development strategy and net zero pledge by 2060. Yet we continue tailoring our approaches, bearing in mind our national circumstances and emerging global challenges, including COVID-19 recovery, macroeconomic instability, and politically motivated sanctions. Needless to say that existing climate SDGs gaps should be addressed regardless of challenges we face. However, what is really important are instruments and approaches that states choose to close these gaps. I would like to stress several points we consider most relevant to this end. First one, it is important to put priority on internationally coordinated actions when developing sustainable and climate policies to make sure we are all moving in the same direction and build trust between states. Second one, strengthening climate action should not undermine the implementation of other SDGs. This is particularly true for SDG 7 on affordable energy. To illustrate the point, it is crucial to provide energy access to indigenous people living in Arctic region of Russia, as they cannot abandon coal fuel there quickly due to logistics and other difficulties. Third, another relevant approach is going local with sustainable and climate policies. Taking local stakeholders on board, among other things, means an opportunity to test regulatory solutions for which a state is not yet ready. This year we have adopted a new regulation that provides for regional carbon pricing pilots, and our first region to implement such a pilot is the Sakhalin region. The best practices from Sakhalin may be later communicated to the rest regions of Russia. And last but not least, we stress the need to put emphasis on incentivizing climate and SDG related policies and projects, rather than imposing restrictions on them. If a policy or a project has a positive climate SDG impact, it should not be discriminated. Once again, thank you for this opportunity, and I wish you a fruitful discussion.
That was the video message from Mr. Alexander Dyukharov, sharing with us the various initiatives that are being taken in Russia on keeping to their 2060 commitments, and of course, and the suite of activities that they're looking at, and of course some preconditions. It would be interesting to come back to the point that he made on energy access, because I've heard this from other places as well. And I hope that some of the other speakers will share their views on whether they actually feel that considerations such as these should be factored in, and how in the net zero commitments that are being made. Let me now invite Mr. Jim Skia, Professor of Sustainable Energy at Imperial College London and co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3, to make his comments. Jim, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lena, and thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to participate in this conference. I'd like to focus just in 2 or 3 minutes very much on the question of linkages between climate change mitigation and the Sustainable Development Goals. And just to say, this was very much a major theme of the Working Group 3 report of IPCC, which was just approved back in April. Now, it's very difficult to turn this into a very small number of remarks, because one of the very large conclusions we have is that linkages tend to be very nationally specific and even locally specific, which means that generalizations are actually quite hard to achieve. And at the insistence of governments, the text of our summary for policymakers is scattered with phrases like according to national and local circumstances. But let me attempt to draw just 3 themes that I think are very much worthwhile drawing out, that gives you a kind of a traffic signal system for knowing whether we should be looking for opportunities in terms of synergies or looking out for trade-offs that might need to be managed. So the first theme would be reduced use of fossil fuels, which is obviously a major part of climate mitigation globally, but also has actually many benefits that are coming through, particularly on things like improvements for air quality, with further consequences for human health in terms of SDG 3 on good health and well-being. Another important point, which is highlighted by global energy difficulties at the moment, is that movements away from fossil fuels tends to enhance energy self-sufficiency, which also helps with SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy. So basically, the reduction in fossil fuels brings many other benefits, with some qualifications that I'll come on to. Second theme is around land use change, and here I'm going to echo many of the remarks made by Sergei Kononov. The IPCC Special Report on Climate Change Land very much demonstrated that making better use of existing land has many synergies in terms of mitigation, adaptation, other sustainable development goals. But when there are land use changes involved, for example, when we have afforestation on agricultural land or very large-scale use of bioenergy with or without carbon capture and storage, then there are potentially many trade-offs that would need to be managed. And these apply to both human systems and natural systems. So in terms of human systems, the very obvious way there can be impacts on food systems with impacts on food prices, and this affects SDG 2 on zero hunger, but also addresses poverty issues if food prices rise. I may say there are also very difficult questions of land tenure as well involved with land use change, with very complex local specificities that need to be considered. And of course, there's already been mentioned, if you have large-scale land use change, there are threats to natural systems as well, and particularly the question of impacts on biodiversity, which our colleagues on the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services would be very concerned about. So SDG 15 on life and land is very much at stake. And the third one I just put out is the concept of just transition, which got a lot of our attention in our approval and maps onto the activities of the Katowice Committee of Experts now operating under the UN FCCC. And obviously, I think the just transition conversation has taken place rather in parallel to the conversation about links with the SDGs, but there are many resonances and echoes to be taken into account. And just to say the fact that the traditional concept of just transition has been about the impacts of running down coal industries and perhaps increasingly oil and gas looking into the future, and what happens to people employed in these industries and the wider social economic impacts. This very much ties into SDG 8 on decent work and sustainable growth. But also very interestingly, the just transition concept is expanding to look at impacts on consumers and people and society more broadly. So again, the question of what happens to energy prices, what happens to food prices, who actually pays for the transition, which is very capital intensive, and whether people on lower incomes can get access to the capital that are needed to institute some of the kind of changes are some of the big issues we need to think about. So I'll finish it off there, but just to say on just transition, I think the key messages are that we do need some sense of planning and forward thinking that links different parts of government to follow up on the agenda. And the other point to make is that if we're going to achieve net zero, it means bringing whole societies along and getting their acceptance. And the procedural aspects of justice involving stakeholders getting participation in decision-making processes is absolutely vital if the net zero transition is going to be socially acceptable in a much wider sense. So I had 2 or 3 minutes. I may have slightly overused it, but I'll finish my remarks there.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think you captured a lot of very important points, which I'm not going to try and summarize, but basically, yes, definitely looking at the tensions between synergies and trade-offs, the complexity of the situation that we are dealing with, especially when we are looking at synergies, and of course, the issues around properly defining just transitions and making the just transitions happen. I think these are all very, very important areas that we have to address ourselves to. I hope to be able to come back to you with some questions on that, but I would also like to encourage in the second round of interventions that we will go through for panelists to also be able to raise questions to each other or speak to interventions that may have been made by earlier speakers as well. Let me now move to Ms. Rohini Kohli for her introductory remarks. She is the lead technical specialist for the National Adaptation Plans at UNDP. Rohini, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srivastava, and really thanks to the organizers for inviting UNDP. I'll just make a few brief remarks on how to harness climate and SDG synergies, the co-benefits and close the ambition gap. So I think when it comes to climate action, the only way to really ratchet up the ambition and meet the goals of Paris is to demonstrate that climate action is central to development action, and that there are benefits, across the sort of climate and development domains. And the instruments of the nationally determined contributions and other adaptation planning exercises such as the national adaptation plans are tools that countries are adopting to do this. And at UNDP, we have been supporting a number of countries on their NDC processes. And a number of countries, I think about 100 of these out of the 120 countries that we've been supporting, over 90% have enhanced their mitigation ambitions. And they've also included adaptation now as a very strong component of their NDCs themselves. And if we just unpack this very quickly, many of these NDCs include energy targets. Some of them include land use, what you call LUCF sectors. 57% cover forestry, 90% cover agriculture, and 96% even refer to gender. So it's very clear that the sectors that are covered are actually the core sectors, which are also the sectors for countries, the economic growth driving sectors. So making sure this alignment is happening, and I don't think we can be sure this alignment between NDCs and SDGs is happening because, there are a lot of climate goals being proposed, but then they require to be mainstreamed in the sectoral processes and also the national development processes. And unpacking those NDC targets and priorities into the development, planning and budgeting process of the country is critical, and it is happening to some extent. And I think this institutional alignment, is gaining pace. And some examples of this, because it is a process that countries are undergoing, and it's not necessary that the institutional alignment is perfect, but there are some examples, and I just want to take a couple of maybe a minute on those. For example, in Nepal, how is this being done? There is a long-term strategy for 2045 for net zero. But they have also looked at their SDG strategies, which are a little bit more near-term because these are 2030 targets, and they have identified areas for more synergistic, sort of alignment between these two processes. Then there are countries such as, like the NDCs of, say, least developed countries like Guinea, where the mitigation and adaptation measures are explicitly aligned in their NDC. Other countries are doing different things. Countries, just giving an example, there are countries that are having their monitoring, reporting, verification systems, such as Uganda, where they are actually tracking the progress of NDC actions towards their SDG implementation process. And lastly, there are countries such as Bosnia-Herzegovina, which have an MNE system where they are incorporating their gender indicators and looking at gender disaggregated data for certain SDGs, such as, SDG 11, cities and human settlements, looking at the municipal level, what is, the sort of priorities at the municipal level in terms of the finance and the investment concepts that need to be developed. And these are really in the development domain, but they have adaptation or mitigation incorporated in them. So so certainly there are a lot of trade-offs, but I think that there are a lot of synergies and a lot of countries are tapping onto these things. So there is a lot of alignment happening, but the critical alignment that has to happen is between the ministries of finance and planning, and not just the ministries of environment, which have actually developed a lot of these NDCs, and a lot of this mainstreaming work into the budgeting process and into the planning processes is happening, but it's not as entrenched as it could be. But clearly there's a lot of movement towards this. And I just want to now come to the point of finance for 30 seconds. I think one of the biggest barriers, apart from the institutional alignment, is the, realizing these effective implementation of NDCs is availability of finance. About 60% of developing countries have reported that finance has been mobilized for NDCs. However, only 15% of these have a coherent, comprehensive NDC financing strategy. And the estimates are staggering. The Standing Committee on Finance has said that, between 5.8 to 5.9 trillion USD is needed to implement the NDCs. And out of that, 112 billion USD is expected to come from domestic sources. So there's a huge gap between, the availability of public and also private finance. So really achieving these NDCs at scale and speed it requires a huge economic transformation as well as a sort of institutional governance transformation that is required. So I think maybe I'll stop there, Dr. Srivastava, perhaps.
Thank you, Rohini. Thank you very much for also sharing those examples and positive examples of actions that are being taken, while at the same time familiarizing us with a lot of the challenges that are still in place, not the least of which is, of course, finance, which we all speak about, but equally the challenges of translating commitments or that are made at a national level down the line to the various ministries and, of course, down to different states, provinces, as the case may be. So thank you very much for that. Let me then move to the next speaker that we have, Mr. Kazuhisa Koakutsu. He's Director of the International Negotiations Office of the Director for International Cooperation for Transition to Decarbonization and Sustainable Infrastructure at the Global Environment Bureau of the Ministry of Environment in Japan. Mr. Koakutsu, please.
Thank you, Dr. Dina Srinivasa, and also distinguished participants. And also, thank you so much for read out all the very long name of these our new organizations under the Ministry of Environment. We have recently restructured our organization to really supporting our partner countries to the decarbonizing the infrastructures, including the policy and measures, and also our financial support. So for that, we are really looking forward to this very important topic of synergies between the climate as well as the SDGs. Let me just to point, I try to simplify the points. One is we talked about the synergy and linkages. One example I like to point out is the synergies between the Paris Agreement, particularly one of the historic outcome from the last Glasgow is the agreement of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is the enhancement of NDC through the international cooperation. That is a linkage that I like to first point it out. And then second is how to institutionalizing this. I think this is one of the key topics that we will be discussing under this session. And I think I also heard that Jim from IPCC mentioned about these linkages, also quite nationally and also locally specific. At the same time, I would also argue that this linkage is already made at the international level. And also this linkage is already establishing between national and local. So I will also one example wanted to provide. And lastly, I think Miss Rohini from UNDP mentioned about the finance. Finance is really important to drive these linkages, particularly how the international climate finance will be aligned Paris Agreement. Especially in the context of this linkage is quite important. So I also mentioned that. So first, I first wanted to mention about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We had a very historic agreement together with the Glasgow Climate Pact. So now we have Article 6 rules agreed. And particularly, I also mentioned Article 6.2, which is basically the guidance for the accounting of how the Article 6 will be operating. Mention about the parties shall promote sustainable development and ensure environmental integrity when they are cooperating in the use of international transfer mitigation outcomes towards the achievement of NDC. So in this context, we can see clearly the linkages between the NDC achievement and also the promotion of the sustainable development. And I like to mention about there is a shall requirement under this Paris Agreement, Article 6, 6.2, which has been elaborated as a rules that the parties, they need to report how how the contribution to the sustainable development is really consistent with the national objectives. Of course, noting these are the national prerogatives. So under the Article 6 rules, the parties needs to report how, when they are cooperating internationally under the Article 6, they need to report how those mitigations outcomes could be contributing to the sustainable development. And also they mentioned about they also need to report, if applicable, the measurement of mitigation co-benefits resulting from adaptation actions and or economic diversification plans. So under the ITOMOS definitions, there is also mentioning about emission reductions and removals, including the mitigation co-benefit resulting from adaptation actions and or economic diversification plans. So I'd like to mention one important point. There is already linkages in this connection between UNFCCC under the Paris Agreement, and when we engage Article 6, there is a reporting on the sustainable development aspects, as well as the mitigation co-benefits. Second point, the institutionalization. There is already the attempt to make these linkages happen under the Article 6. For example, we have Japanese government implementing joint crediting mechanism. We call it the JCM under the Article 6, where we have already some countries, we have created rules to develop so-called the sustainable development guidelines, where they engaging in the joint crediting mechanism, they need to report how these the projects under the JCM will be contributing to the sustainable development, not only just at the time of the realization, but also at the time of the issuance of the credit, so that under the life cycle of the project, there is a reporting requirement for the sustainable development. So in that context, there is cases where the specific mechanism are implementing such linkages for the reporting purposes, as well as ensuring how the project is contributing sustainable development, as well as, of course, achieving the emission reductions towards the NDCs. The last point about the finance, I think this is also quite a lot of currently many multilateral development organizations and also many countries are aiming to so-called the Paris alignment for their investment objectives. So we see many private companies are trying to be Paris alignment in their emission inventories. And also, again, parties already try to achieve their 1.5 degrees, as we can see from the Glasgow Climate Act. So I think it is important that this finance flow needs to be, really needs to be in line with the Paris Agreement goal. So how to do this? I think we definitely require for the support for the capacity building from our point of view to start with. And then scaling up these efforts to facilitating more implementation of this. And I think Article 6 is one example how these synergies could be happen. And our Ministry of Environment is looking forward to really contributing in this aspect. So just food for thoughts, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for bringing our attention to Article 6 and its requirements and how it promotes the synergies, as also the experience that you have in Japan in incorporating sustainable development achievements in the guidelines that you have come up for the climate projects. So thank you very much for all of that. Let me now move to our next speaker, Mr. Dio Gabinete. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing your last name. Do help me with that. He's Regional Manager for Asia Pacific and Eastern Europe NDC Partnership in the Bangkok office.
Thanks, Tina. You got my name correctly. Don't worry about that. So good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the NDC Partnership, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity to share our experiences as well as insights for this session. So I'm giving my remarks on how can national determined contributions, or NDCs, and voluntary national reports can be further improved in the future. But since I'm speaking for the NDC partnership, I'll be speaking mostly on how NDCs can be further improved in the next iterations, but I'll also be touching lightly on how NDCs and national reporting processes can be mutually strengthened. Many of the improvements that we've seen in recent NDC submissions have very positive knock-on effects towards the achievement as well as the monitoring and reporting of the country's SDG targets. So moving towards our experience leading up to the 2020 NDC update process, the NDC partnership launched what we call the Climate Action Enhancement Package to fast-track support for NDC enhancement and implementation. Together with about 46 development partners, which included UN Climate Change, UNDP, Climate Analytics, and GIZ, we have delivered NDC enhancement in about 55 countries through a combination of different technical assistance support for different activities ranging from developing studies and analysis for specific topics, engaging stakeholders, and revising national strategies, as well as supporting gender balance and transparency in their NDCs. What we have observed in this round of NDC submission was that there's a substantial increase in the robustness in the process as well as methodology, and also in the rigor in terms of quality of data and evidence utilized to inform the country's decisions in setting their targets. This in turn strengthened the ownership, understanding, and awareness among different government agencies and other actors on what their countries are committing. And of course, many countries have also increased their ambition by setting higher overall targets or by increasing their sector coverage or shortening the timeframes for reaching their NDC targets. We also note that many countries, especially developing ones, included adaptation in their NDCs, as also shared by Rohini earlier. It is imperative that this positive trend continue in the next update cycle in 2025 and also beyond. Processes will need to be further improved, making it more inclusive and transparent, and the quality of evidence and data generation and collection should ensure further soundness and robustness for this information. As countries gear up in the operationalization of their enhanced transparency frameworks, they will also need to build their capacities to transition to the biennial transparency report, or BTRs, developing or strengthening their MRV systems so that their progress on NDC implementation and other developments related to climate action can be properly reported in their BTRs or national communications. Many parties have also submitted their long-term or net zero strategies in 2020 or 2021. This implies further efforts from countries to ensure alignment of their NDCs and LTS and vice versa. And in many cases of the former or the NDCs were developed before the LTS. As such, countries will need to play some sort of catch-up to ensure the proper sequencing and enhancement of these two very important global commitment frameworks. The increased quality of data-driven evidence and much more streamlined MRV systems for these two will make it much easier to generate the necessary information for national reports required from these parties. And we also recommend countries to develop robust implementation frameworks, just strategies, action plans, investment plans. So it's a sort of a programmatic approach to guide countries to reach their targets and also help development partners in programming very finite resources to support countries to achieve their NDCs and the long-term strategies. And as mentioned by Rohini and I mentioned earlier, many countries have also reflected their adaptation priorities in their NDCs. However, reflecting on recent events, there's also an increasing recognition that we need to safeguard and minimize the risks or minimize the risk brought by extreme climate change, extreme weather events due to climate and extreme weather events to public investments, including critical energy, infrastructure, transport, as well as health. Mainstreaming risks into development of mitigation policies, development agenda, public investments to make them more robust and resilient to disasters, conflicts, and scarcity of resources. Civil unrest and other forms of internal and external shocks will be very critical in both near and long term. So that's all from our side, and yielding back to you, Lina.
Thank you very much, Dio. That was quite a comprehensive coverage of all the things that you're doing. And thank you so much for all your efforts in NDC enhancement that are taking place and also identifying the issues by which these can be further strengthened as we go along. I'm sure we'll have many questions for you. Let me now move to our next speaker, Mr. Stephen Draxler, Technical Advisor, NDC Transport Initiative for Asia from the German International Cooperation Agency, GIZ. Stephen?
Thanks for the nice introduction. You also got my name completely right, so thanks for that. And thanks to the organizers for inviting GIZ to this event. So the German Agency for International Cooperation, of course. So I'll be speaking a bit more from the project implementation perspective. I currently work as a technical advisor in the NDC Transport Initiative for Asia, where we're working on slowing the GHG emission growth in the transport sector and also demonstrating that peaking of GHG emissions is possible within the Asian context. We also look at additional benefits, creating other pressing problems such as congestion, air pollution, and other co-benefits, which also is why I'm talking here today, of course. So I would like to go a bit into more detail on how co-benefits can be mainstreamed into policy-making processes. So this is basically one of the core things we do in our project, and it's also, of course, a challenge and a good question actually to tackle. So as I mentioned in our project, we work on the transport transition in Asia. So the core goal of this is really to move away from fossil fuels towards more sustainable transport options. And of course, this rings a bell. There are many options or many possibilities for co-benefits in this area, be it in the area of e-mobility, public transport, smart mobility services, as well as creating more livable, walkable, cyclable cities. So of course, our main goal in this project is to tackle GHG emissions, but also I think we've got in our activities, we've got a lot of co-benefits. For example, SDG 3, improving the health of citizens, especially in urban areas, making cities more livable by reducing local emissions, local pollutants. Then also SDG 9 is a big topic because of course in this transition we need to create new innovative resilient infrastructure and also need to of course promote sustainable industrialization in the countries we work in. So it's clearly also a technological opportunity, this transport transition. Adding to this, I would also mention SDG 7. As we know, the transport transition gives us a huge opportunity to move towards more fuel-efficient vehicles, which are cheaper in operation and also allows us the chance to reduce the reliance on imported fossil fuels and create or source locally installed renewable energy. So maybe in regards what we do in project implementation to actually get these co-benefits on board in the policy-making processes. So one key step definitely is getting clarity on what these co-benefits are. And this can be done through, let's say, technical studies we release. So we work a lot on the topic e-mobility. Of course, I mentioned it beforehand. So for example, we are developing an e-mobility roadmap for a large city in Vietnam, where we of course try to focus on GHG emissions reduction, but we also want to quantify what the impact is on the health of the citizens of this city when we plan to move away from fossil fuels. Another factor we are observing or studying closely in this roadmap is how to foster the role of the local industry. And so how can we introduce innovation? How can we build capacity? So this will be one part, so clear this clarity or provide this clarity to decision makers in the policy making process. And also another big part is involving different policy decision makers in this policy making process. That's why in the countries we work in this project, we have large activities in building stakeholder platforms, be it on provincial, national, or regional level, where we try to really include a diverse stakeholder environment or setup, so to say, where we of course also get people onto the table that are to the table, sorry, not onto the table, that are at the table, who also look into or prioritize these co-benefits as integral part of the process. So this is more or less in a nutshell regarding the question how we can include co-benefits into the policy making process from a more implementation, project implementation view. So this is what I would like to add. Happy to hand over again and to step in later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for sharing those experiences on how to bring in co-benefits. At some time, I'm assuming that you have been successful in doing so and bringing it into policy-making frameworks as well. But as you said, questions is something that we can take up in the next round, hopefully. Let me move to our last speaker, Ms. Yukari Takamura, Professor, Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. Pleasure to see you here, Yukari. Please go ahead.
Hi, Lina. Lovely to see you again. So first of all, I'd like to send my gratitude to organizers, UNDESA and also the IGES, to inviting me as a speaker in such a wonderful setting. So as Lina in her keynote speech, suggested that rapid transformation and the rapid investment in the net zero emission pathway, could provide quite the important benefit than the delayed pathway. So from such perspective, I like to focus on the one question: how to mobilize the public and private investment in climate action. So that's for that. Focusing on this question, I like to lay a couple of points. Lucky news for us is that we see an increasing investment toward the clean energy investment, clean energy sectors transition. We see a record 755 billion to decarbonize the energy system in 2021. Actually, that is well above the previous year by 27%, I think. So mainly go to the wind and solar installation and also the electric vehicle. So the radical transformation of global energy system is essential to achieve net zero emission in 2050. So as you know, that the International Energy Agency with in here its net zero emission scenario suggests that the annual investment in energy from actually the currently just over the $2 trillion globally on average, but which should go to almost $5 trillion by 2030, and by 2050 to the 4.5 trillion. So we need definitely gigantic investment only in the clean energy sector for transition. So in light of such a gigantic scale of investment, I understand that private investment is quite vital, and it's actually gaining its importance. So if we look at the study relating to the possible investment risk and barriers linked to clean energy infrastructure project, one of the risks is policy and regulatory risk. For instance, the lack of long-term low-carbon development strategies, or lack of political commitment or policy uncertainty, or the existing of fossil fuel subsidies, which make other investments more attractive to investors, and unstable carbon price. So that suggests that we need a clear policy direction, which send a clear signal to the society toward the net zero or carbon society. So I see here the possibility of the synergy between the increasing the investment and strengthening the policy under the Paris Agreement. For instance, the long-term strategy and goal NDC process, with the 5-year cycle under the Paris Agreement. If we could strengthen these policy instruments, we make the investment ecosystem more attractive to the private sectors. So the second point, it's actually not comment, rather the question to other panelists. Still, I see that public investment is quite important to mobilize private investment. Also, I understand that the public investment maybe they should go to the area in which the private investment is difficult to mobilize. So this question may be answered by the Lohini of the UNDP or Stefan from the GIZ, I expect. So the last not least is that of course, to canalize financial flow to the project and especially to make our society to the net zero society. Of course, we need a good project. Incorporating the synergy and minimizing the possible trade-off. So I think that planning is important, as other panelists suggested. And also, I also echo with others on the point that the public participation, especially to ensure the inclusiveness of the society. From that perspective, we did the research on the public participation. Some developing country, that we interview, the people say that often the project assisted and implemented by the World Bank, such as a multilateral financial institution, such as World Bank, and bilateral financial institution or regional financial institution, could create a good model to enhance the planning to incorporate this synergy and synergy factors, and also enhance the public participation. For such a reason, I see that the more aggressive law of the multilateral financial institution, in regional bilateral one, to enhance the good, canalize, mobilize the private investment especially in developing countries. With that, I back to microphone to Lina. Thank you.
Thank you, Yukari, and thank you for emphasizing the role of the private sector and the investments from there in being able to achieve objectives of both climate change and SDGs in a synergistic manner, and also identifying, of course, the risks that we have to be able to deal with, and the role of multilateral institutions as well. With that, we have been through the first round of interactions, and we have heard the different speakers that we have today on this particular session. Can I see the gallery view of all speakers, please? Because I cannot see anyone on the screen. Can I see everyone together? Thank you so much. We have had several very important messages coming through, a few threads that have run through the interventions that everybody has made. It has to do with the role of institutions, the importance of capacity building, the issue of mainstreaming co-benefits and how do we go about doing that, local context, and of course, public participation, and just a little bit on the differences on net zero as well. We are running a little bit behind time, but we started late, so I hope that we can also run a few minutes over, if that's all right with all the panelists as well. The challenge would be to see what questions one would really like to be able to ask, and have every one of you come back for a second round of interventions if you would like to. Given the particular theme that we have of the conference, I'm not going to try and go through the list of questions that most of you have, but really focus on the fact that if we are to actually realize these synergies that we are talking about and that we recognize between SDGs, climate change and SDGs, between mitigation and ambition, between the public and private sector investments, as you brought out at the end, Yukari, if we are to look at all these synergistic opportunities that are available to us, recognizing the fact that when we talk about challenges and opportunities at a global level, these do not necessarily translate one-to-one at a national or local context level, which again several of you pointed out towards. What do you see as the main barriers and opportunities? What do you see as opportunities for capacity building, or almost needs for capacity building that can be taken up at a global level? What do you see as opportunities for also enhancing public participation where this may have worked, and the translation of your experiences into policy making? So I've tried to combine or make a much broader question of everything that we can in the interest of time. And I'm going to leave it to you to see how you would like to address yourself to this way forward kind of question that we are looking at. Where do we go from everything that we have heard just now? So I'll open the floor. And of course, Yukari had a question to a couple of you as well that she identified, but others might also want to jump in. So I'm going to just open the floor and request you to raise your hands if you would like to ask or respond to that. And let me take Jim first. And in the meanwhile, also ask if, I don't think we have time for questions from the audience. So Jim, please go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, there's an awful lot in there, but maybe I could pick up on some of the remarks that were made about finance, which is another issue that Working Group 3 paid a lot of attention to. And just emphasize there are gaps in financing right across the domain: mitigation, adaptation, developed countries, developing countries. But a very important conclusion is that the gaps are bigger for adaptation than they are for mitigation. And that's the co-chair of Working Group 3 on mitigation saying that. And they're much bigger for developing countries than for developed countries. But a clear conclusion is there is enough money in the global system to raise that 5 or 6 trillion a year that's needed. The question is getting the money directed into the right places. And I think this is actually an area where mitigation and adaptation may diverge a bit, because with Article 6, the ITMOs, there's a price for carbon. We have tradable commodities, which means that it's easier to get the private sector engaged. And perhaps the bigger role for public finance in terms of mitigation is to unlock the level of private finance that's needed to get things moving. And our report talked a lot about the various instruments for doing that. With adaptation, I think it's a slightly different issue. And certainly when I was in Bonn at the subsidiary bodies meeting, there was an awful lot of input from developing countries to argue that there needed to be much more grant funding for adaptation measures, perhaps tied to the loss and damages kind of debate as well. So I think we need to be very careful in thinking about the right kind of funding instruments for the right purpose. Two challenges that I would just flag out is that many of the projects that need to be carried out are very small scale in nature. Things like home retrofitting, projects that would need to be undertaken by farmers operating at a fairly small scale. And there is a big challenge about aggregating smaller projects into bigger bundles that financial institutions will be able to direct money at. And I would just emphasize, I think somebody else said it, the importance of soft finance, as it were, for capacity building so that countries are able to direct their own activities in the right direction. I would really emphasize.
Thank you very much for all of that. Please, Kazuhi-san.
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe in terms of kind of way forward, also addressing some of the issues around capacity building, I think I also like to emphasize a lot of partnership to really enabling this implementation. So Article 6 is just rules are just agreed. The implementation is from now on. So many countries needs to understand, and also including how to report under the biennial transparency report will be starting from 2024 and onwards. So I think we need to have a very focused and coordinated manner to enable all those interested countries to join. We see many countries, even the revised NDC, more than 120 countries are interested in Article 6. But we need to support strengthening so those parties to participate. At the same time, I think we also need to incorporate the private sector to come in. And I also do agree that maybe public finance to start with some piloting, some of the advanced work, to which I think private sector could also follow. So I think those kind of partnership between government and the private sector is a key to achieve our goal. Just finished up.
Thank you very much. I've been told by the organizers we have less than 5 minutes, so may I request you to keep your comments to about a minute each. Rohini, please, and then Yukari.
Yeah, I think just to say, I mean, my fellow panelists have raised very key points. I think for Professor Yukari's question, I mean, there are areas, I mean, I have an adaptation bias. I work on adaptation, but I have to say that investment in the transformation of clean energy will have a huge adaptation benefit as well. And at the moment is being seen as a mitigation issue, which it is, but it has a massive adaptation benefit. So, I mean, it really must be prioritized through public and private sources. I think about the issue of, where private finance can come in and where public finance can come in. I think that, one of the sort of, very important intellectual contributions, even, from the discussion globally and from Japan has been the issue of human security. At the moment, human security for various reasons is under difficulties. There's a limited fiscal space in many countries now. There's inflation, there's food crisis, etc. That's going to really have a shrinking public, space in terms of finance. So I think we will find the investments in water, in food security, in health, all of these traditional, we call them social sectors, but they're also economic sectors linked to this. It's going to be difficult to find the public finance, at the baseline level, because normally public finance is a baseline, private sector then comes in. I'm not an economist, but I know that you need that core public finance to also trigger investments in private. But the problem is the public finance is shrinking. So, there has to be some, I think, recognition in the climate community that we have to look at the mainstream issues in terms of SDGs and try to really look at what is happening to the fiscal space in countries. But there are huge opportunities for partnership, like our fellow panelist, Mr. from MOEJ has said. A lot of work can be accomplished through international and national partnerships. I mean, it's all not, doom and gloom. But I think we have to prioritize small island states and LDCs. They don't have a private sector the way middle income countries have them. So I think that if we have to prioritize also, funding of public funding internationally, there has to be some support really for those countries which do not have the kind of private sector that, slightly more richer countries may have. But anyway, I think, and the last thing is SDGs and net zero should be aligned. SDGs are 2030. So that's much closer than 2050. And there has to be more action towards towards that deadline. Back to you. Sorry, I took more time.
Thank you. Yukari, please.
Thank you. Thank you, especially the Rohini, to responding to my question. I think we see the much potential of the co-benefit, between the climate action and the other SDGs. So how to make this co-benefit more visible, that is, I think, quite an important challenge for us. So in addition to the enhanced implementation of NDCs under the Paris Agreement, and of course the role of financial institutions, in addition to that, I think especially as the Professor Jim Skee mentioned, that the price of carbon is quite key, and also current situation surrounding the companies. They wish to do more sustainable business, especially in the context of the ESG investing or sustainable financing. The many countries wish to enhance or strengthen the sustainability disclosure by the companies. I think such kind of companies' action, we need definitely policy side need to accelerate this kind of action. I think that is the 2 points that I like to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dio.
Right, it's hard to be the last one speaking, but I tried to encapsulate the thoughts as many of you have shared, and I would just like to reiterate the three things that we're really trying to look at. It's the issue of capacity in terms of technical, as well as fiduciary capacity. There has been, it's an age-old question of, once we have the resources, how will the countries manage that resources if they want to really implement those adaptation mitigation projects in a direct manner? And there still needs a lot of work to be done in terms of, let's say, just greening the public financial system. Yukari mentioned some of those initial steps that can be done to increase disclosure reporting, not just in the private sector, but also ensuring that the central banks have capacity to do exposure to mainstream climate risk exposure, do climate stressing and such, ensuring that these are mainstream in their fiscal policies. And then again, one thing that I think we still need to resolve is the issue of bandwidth, especially in small island developing states. Bandwidth in terms of catering to the responses that they are receiving from development partners, from IFIs, to do this and that mitigation adaptation project. That is really is something that I don't think we have been able to resolve for the past several decades. And maybe one of the ways that we can do it is by leveraging it, leveraging resources at a more meso scale. But again, this needs cooperation, partnership, not just within among development partners, donors, but also amongst the beneficiary countries themselves. So that's my last thought.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for bringing up a couple of new issues for all of you. I don't see any more hands, so and we are completely out of time, so I'm just going to take this opportunity to thank all of you for all your comments. I'm not going to try and summarize, but there are some very clear trends that have come out from the interventions that all of you have made, and we will try and see if we can summarize that in the final session that will be taking place in just a little while. Thank you all very, very much for being with us and for tolerating all the inconveniences from starting late. Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you to the audience as well for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lina and all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lina.
Thanks. Have a nice day.